An old man stands on the eastern ridge of the Moabite mountains, staring across the Jordan River. At the specific Hebrew vocabulary Moses chooses in his final breaths, you start to see something the legal reading completely misses. 40 years earlier, when their throats were cracking with thirst and the livestock were dropping dead in the sand, Moses stood before a flinty cliff in Horeb. He struck it. Water exploded from the stone. It poured out in a torrential flood, pooling in the dust, saving an entire nation from dying of dehydration. They survived because the Tzur was struck. 14 centuries later, a Jewish scholar named Paul sits down with a piece of parchment and writes a letter to a church in Corinth. He looks back at this exact moment in the desert. He looks at the water pouring from the stone, and he makes a claim that shatters everything the rabbis thought they knew. He says our fathers all drank the same spiritual drink. He says they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Paul is not speaking in artistic symbols. He is revealing the identity of the architect. He is telling them that the very presence, sustaining them in the blistering heat, was the pre-incarnate Jesus. He was the water in the wasteland. He was the shadow in the scorching sun. He was the granite shield between a fragile people and an unforgiving desert. Deuteronomy is not a list of rules for an ancient nation. It is the shadow of a person. The old man singing on the mountain is not just looking back at their history. He is looking squarely at the one who kept them breathing. But a rock is a defensive structure. It is a place to hide. And the people standing on the edge of the Jordan are not about to hide. They are about to march into a brutal, contested land. To survive what is coming, they will need something more terrifying than a stone. They will need the fire. Moses shifts his metaphor. He moves from the stone to the flame. Deuteronomy chapter 4 is relentless. Moses reminds the people of the mountain. He reminds them of the terror. He reminds them of the blinding light. You heard the sound of words, he says, but saw no form. There was only a voice. And then he delivers a defining theological statement. Verse 20. For the Lord your God is a consuming fire. Think about the nature of fire. Fire does not negotiate. Fire does not compromise. Fire does not respect boundaries. Fire consumes whatever it touches. We are a species obsessed with physical forms. We want statues. We want icons. We want carved wood and polished stone. We want a deity we can touch. We want a God we can control. We want something we can lock safely inside a temple. But the God of Deuteronomy, the real question of this book isn't, what did Moses want them to do? It's this. Who did Moses want them to look for? Refuses the box. He appears as a blazing furnace. He guards the gates of Eden with a flaming sword. He speaks from a burning bush in Midian. He splits the dark sky over Sinai. He leads 1 million nomads through the freezing blackness of the desert night. Same element, same devastating power. The fire is not a symbol of God's anger. It is the raw, unshielded reality of His holiness. And this presents a terrifying problem for humanity. You cannot embrace a fire. You cannot hold a conversation with a furnace. If God remains only a consuming fire, humanity is kept at an infinite, terrified distance. The gap remains uncrossable. This is exactly why the promise of the Nabi, the coming prophet, is the most important lifeline in the entire book. The people need the voice from the fire, but they need it wrapped in human flesh. They need the burning, unyielding holiness of God to be mediated through a man they can actually look at without having their retinas burned away. They need the infinite to become intimate. They need the fire to become a face. Generations rise. Generations die. The Babylonians burn the city. The Persians send them home. The Greeks march through the valley. The Romans build their roads. 4 empires rise and fall. Through it all, the Jewish scholars unroll the heavy parchment. They trace the Hebrew letters. They read the words of Moses. They look for the prophet like him, and the answer changes how you read every single chapter he left behind. To feel the weight of this moment, you have to realize they wait for the voice from the flame to speak through human vocal cords. And when the wait finally ends, It does not happen in a temple in Jerusalem. It does not happen in a palace. It happens on another violently shaking mountain, and Moses himself actually shows up to witness it. 3 men follow a carpenter up a high peak in the dark. The air grows thin. The wind cuts through their woven cloaks. They reach the summit, and then the carpenter begins to change. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all struggle to find human words to describe the physics of this moment. They say his face shines like the sun. They say his clothes become as blindingly white as lightning. The fire that had been hidden beneath human skin suddenly burns through the veil of his flesh. And then, 2 figures step out of the shadows of eternity. Eliah, the prophet of the fire, and Moses. Think about the geographical and poetic weight of this moment. For 14 centuries, Moses has been dead. He was buried in an unmarked grave across the Jordan River. Forbidden from ever entering the land, he spent his entire life marching toward. But here he is, standing inside the borders of Israel, standing on a mountain. But this time, he is not the mediator. He is not the one with the glowing face. He is looking at the one with the glowing face. A thick, heavy cloud sweeps over the peak, what is about to be lost. This generation has only known a world mediated by one human being. The disciples are immediately plunged into the same suffocating, terrifying darkness their ancestors felt at the base of Mount Sinai. They collapse into the dirt. They cover their heads, and a voice thunders from the cloud. "This is my beloved son. Listen to him." The instruction is incredibly precise. God does not tell them to listen to Moses. He does not tell them to listen to Elijah. The command points exclusively to the carpenter. The transfiguration is not a random supernatural display. It is the closing of a 1400-year loop. Moses is not passing the torch. He is bowing to the fire. The promise of Deuteronomy 18 is standing right in front of him. The Nabi has finally arrived. The one who can stand in the unmediated presence of the divine mind and carry the words back to the camp without being consumed. God has taken the consuming fire of Sinai and folded it into the chest cavity of a Jewish man from Nazareth. When the disciples finally dare to look up, the cloud is gone. The mountain is quiet. Moses and Elijah have vanished. They see no one, except Jesus only. The mediator has taken his place. The prophet like Moses is here. But if the prophet has arrived, and the voice from the fire is now walking through the dusty streets of Jerusalem, it forces an inevitable collision. When fire descended on Mount Sinai, Moses stood in the heat. When water was needed in the barren places, Moses struck the stone. Because Moses left behind more than just a prophecy. He left behind a massive, heavy scroll of laws, and the men holding that scroll are not about to let it go without a fight. The religious elite unroll the heavy parchment. They trace the faded ink with wooden pointers. They memorize every syllable of the old man's final speech. By the time Jesus walks into Jerusalem, the book of Deuteronomy has become a weapon. The Pharisees and scribes have taken the soaring, desperate farewell of Moses and turned it into an iron cage of compliance. They police the borders of the Sabbath. They measure the exact tithing of mint and cumin. They hold the scroll up like a shield, daring anyone to challenge the authority of the ancient text. But Jesus does not read Deuteronomy like a lawyer. He reads it like an author. Look at what happens when he is driven into the Judean wilderness. He fasts in the punishing heat for 40 days. His physical body is starved. The devil approaches him in the wasteland and launches 3 calculated strikes against his identity. And every single time, Jesus opens his mouth to fight back. He pulls his ammunition from the exact same scroll. Man shall not live by bread alone. Deuteronomy chapter 8. You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Deuteronomy chapter 6. When guilt threatened to consume the camp, Moses walked into the thick darkness of the tent of meeting. He was their shield. You shall worship the Lord your God. Deuteronomy chapter 6. He does not quote the poetry of David. He does not quote the visions of Daniel. When the Son of God needs to anchor his own human mind in the blistering heat of the desert, he reaches for the final sermon of Moses because he knows the secret the Pharisees have missed. In John chapter 5, the religious leaders confront Jesus, demanding he justify his authority. They cite the law. They point to the traditions. Jesus looks at these men, gripping their scrolls so tightly their knuckles are white, and delivers a diagnosis that shatters their entire worldview. You search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that bear witness about me. And then, the absolute killing blow. If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. The Pharisees thought Moses was writing a rule book. Jesus says Moses was writing a biography. Deuteronomy is not a cage, designed to trap a nation in a system of rules. It is a scaffolding designed to hold them until the builder arrives. Every law about a flawless sacrifice pointed to a body that would be broken on Roman wood. Every restriction about the priesthood pointed to a mediator who would never die. Every terrifying warning about the fire on the mountain pointed to a God who was willing to step into the flames. He was their voice. He was the only reason they had survived the sheer, raw presence of the divine. Now, that mediator is leaving to pull his people out. They were so obsessed with reading the ink on the page that they did not recognize the word when it stood right in front of them, breathing their air. But the architect did not just come to tear down the scaffolding. He came to do the one thing the old man on the ridge of Moab could never do for his people. A terrified nation stood at the base of the fire and begged for a mediator to shield them from the light. A dying camp struck a granite cliff in the wasteland, and the shadow of Christ poured out as water to keep them breathing. An old man sang his final song on the ridge of Moab and buried a promise that would echo for 14 centuries. The scholars searched the heavy parchment for a rigid rulebook and missed the breathing biography hiding in the ink. A carpenter starved in the blistering Judean desert and fought back the darkness using the ancient words of the law. A thick cloud descended on the Mount of Transfiguration, and the voice from the flame finally spoke through human flesh. The prophet who could breathe inside the fire stepped out of eternity and walked his fragile people out of the wasteland. The panic setting into the camp must have been suffocating. How do you step into a brutal, contested land, and how do you survive a holy God? Same ancient text, same living word. But here is the part I keep coming back to. That old man standing on the ridge of Moab, looking at a violent horizon he was not allowed to cross. Moses had to wear a physical veil over his face just so his own brother wouldn't be blinded by the residual energy of God. He carried the terrifying, crushing weight of standing between two worlds. But he knew his human lungs would eventually stop pulling in the desert air. He knew his fragile system was never meant to be permanent. If you are in a season where the rules of religion feel like a heavy, iron cage, where you are exhausted by trying to measure up to an impossible standard, Deuteronomy is a place to stop and breathe. Faith is not the memorization of a legal code. It is the recognition of a person. The infinite creator of the cosmos did not retreat into the silence of heaven when we failed. He became the Nabi. He became the stone in the desert. He became the face in the fire. And may the God who has never once abandoned his people in the wilderness walk with you through yours and show you the face behind the flame. Without the man who knows how to talk to him, Moses knows this terror. He feels the collective anxiety of 2 million people. The wind blows hot off the Rift Valley, carrying the smell of crushed sage and desert dust. Below him, 2 million nomads wait in the shimmering heat, staring at a violent horizon without their leader. And so, right in the middle of his farewell address, he does not just give them laws to obey. He drops a promise that alters the trajectory of human history. He tells them about someone who is coming. But to understand the magnitude of who this person is, you cannot start with the promise. You have to start with the terrifying reality of the mountain where it all began, 40 years earlier. An entire nation stood at the base of a violently shaking peak. The sky turned black. Lightning shattered the darkness. And then came a voice, a sound so massive, so structurally overwhelming, that the people physically could not endure it. Deuteronomy chapter 5 records the exact reaction of the camp that day. They did not celebrate the revelation. They panicked. They approached Moses, trembling, and begged him to step between them and the fire. If we hear the voice of the Lord our God anymore, we shall die. You go near and hear all that the Lord our God says, and you speak to us." This request establishes the fundamental architecture of the Old Testament. The gap between an infinitely holy Creator and a deeply flawed human race cannot be bridged casually. It requires a shock absorber. It requires someone who can stand. You can hear the low murmur of the camp, the restless shifting of livestock, the hum of a generation born in a wasteland, in the presence of lethal perfection, and live to carry the message back to the camp. Their terror was not a failure of courage. It was the only rational response to unmediated glory. God actually validates their fear. He tells Moses, "They are right in all that they have spoken." And so, the pattern is set. God will not speak directly to the masses. He will speak to the mediator, and the mediator will speak to the masses. For 4 decades, this fragile system holds. When God's anger burns, Moses stands in the breach to plead for mercy. When complex architectural instructions for the tabernacle are given, they are delivered through human vocal cords. Moses carries the terrifying weight of standing in 2 worlds, representing God to the people, and representing the people to God. But systems built on mortal men have an expiration date. Now, Moses is standing on the ridge of Moab, looking at a promised land he cannot enter. His lungs will soon stop pulling in the desert air. His voice will fall silent, and the Israelites know it. If God's presence is lethal, without a mediator, they are looking at the water. He is looking at the future. Moses knows he is not crossing over, and the mediator is about to be buried in an unmarked grave. The entire covenant is facing an existential crisis. How does the infinite continue to speak to the finite? Will God retreat into the silence of heaven? Will the priests take over the divine voice? Moses answers, the silent terror of the camp. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, he lays down a prophecy that will become the obsession of the Jewish people for the next 14 centuries. He promises that the voice from the fire will speak again. He promises a successor, but the way he describes the one who is coming creates a profound paradox. Watch the camp when Moses walks to the tent. Every man stands at his door. Every woman stops her work. The desert wind seems to go quiet. They watch the old man walk past the edge of the camp. He enters the heavy canvas. The thick cloud drops down. The presence of God descends like a physical weight. You can almost feel the air pressure change in the valley. And then, something unprecedented happens. God speaks, not in riddles, not in dark visions, not in the hazy symbols of a midnight dream. God speaks to a human being, as a man speaks to his friend, face to face. He has 120 years of history in his bones. He has 40 years of wandering calloused into his feet. Look at what happens when he steps back out into the sun. His skin literally radiates. The residual energy of the divine presence clings to his physical body. The people cannot even look at him without shielding their eyes. He has to cover his head just to stand in front of his own brother. The veil is not a symbol of his holiness. It is a shield for their survival. This is the face-to-face problem. It is the gold standard of revelation. But it creates an impossible standard for leadership. Abraham heard voices in the night. Jacob wrestled a stranger in the dust. Joseph decoded the nightmares of a pharaoh. But Moses gets clear, unfiltered, waking dialogue. The book of Numbers makes this distinction explicitly. God defends Moses against a rebellion by drawing a hard line in the sand. He tells the critics that when there is a normal messenger, he speaks in a vision. He speaks in a dream, not with Moses, with him. I speak mouth to mouth. If the defining characteristic of Moses is this unmediated, terrifyingly close proximity to the divine mind, how do you replace him? You don't just need a good general. You don't just need a wise judge. You need a man who can breathe inside the fire. Deuteronomy ends with a haunting epitaph. Chapter 34, verse 10, and he has only a few hours left to speak. So he opens his mouth and delivers the longest unbroken speech in the entire biblical record. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Generations pass. Centuries roll by. Judges swing swords. Kings wear crowns. Priests burn incense, but none of them walk into the cloud. None of them hear the unfiltered voice. None of them return with a glowing face. The gap remains empty until Moses himself, standing on that Moabite ridge in chapter 18, gives them the exact word to look for. He tells them that the silence will not last forever. He points past the judges. He points past the kings. And he drops a title that will echo for 1400 years. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15. The Israelites are staring at an impending future without the only mediator they have ever known. And Moses tells them this: "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers." The word our English Bibles translate as prophet here is the Hebrew nabi. It is a word that will define the rest of the Old Testament, but its etymology reveals something entirely different than what modern readers picture. The root of nabi is connected to an ancient Semitic verb, meaning to bubble up or to pour forth. When we hear the word prophet, we usually imagine a mystic, someone staring into the distance. Most people assume the book of Deuteronomy, this final address of Moses, is exactly what its Greek name suggests: a second giving of the law, to predict political events or personal fortunes. But in the ancient text, a nabi is not fundamentally a fortune teller. A nabi is someone who has been filled so completely with the divine mind that the words have no choice but to spill out. If seeing the raw, ancient machinery beneath these English translations is stirring up questions you've never considered, you're exactly who this channel is for. Drop a thought in the comments and hit subscribe, because every week we go deeper into the text than you knew was possible. So the Jewish people spend the next 14 centuries scanning the horizon, waiting for a nabi who bubbles up with the unmediated words of God. But Moses adds a terrifying qualifier. He says this coming prophet will be like me. Think about the sheer, crushing weight of that comparison. To be a prophet like Moses, you cannot just preach compelling sermons. You must be able to stand on the violently shaking mountain. You must be able to walk into the suffocating, dark cloud of the divine presence without your physical body being consumed. You must be able to speak to the infinite creator of the cosmos, face to face, absorbing the lethal perfection of God, so that the fragile people in the camp do not die. The promise of Deuteronomy 18 is not a prediction of a religious teacher. They see a dry legal document. They see a repetition of Leviticus. They assume it is a long, exhausting list of ancient restrictions about what to wear. It is the guarantee of a new mediator. Every time a new leader arises in Israel's history, the people hold their breath. They look at the new man and ask the silent question: is he the one? Is it Joshua? No. Joshua is a brilliant tactician with a bronze sword. But he is not a mediator with a glowing face. Is it David? No. David is a king with a harp and a shepherd's sling. But he is a man of bloodshed who cannot even build the temple. Is it the mighty Elijah? Elijah calls literal fire from the sky. But even he has to wrap his face in a heavy cloak and hide in the back of a cave when the presence of God actually passes by. None of them are the nabi who can stand bare-faced in the fire. But Moses did not just leave them with a professional title. As the desert sun begins to set on his final day, he opens his mouth and sings one last song over the assembly, and he buries another massive, poetic clue right in the lyrics. The sun drops low over the Moabite ridge. The sky bleeds into crushed violet and bruised red. The heat of the day lifts off the valley floor, leaving a sudden, biting chill in the air: how to harvest grain and how to govern a camp. But if you look closer at the strange anomalies hiding inside the law codes, Moses does not end his final day with a legal brief. He ends it with a song. His voice, ancient and weathered, carries across the silent camp. 2 million people listen to a melody they are commanded to memorize, a rhythm designed to lodge in their bones long after the singer is dead. Deuteronomy chapter 32 is a haunting, soaring piece of Hebrew poetry. He sings of an eagle catching its young. He sings of honey out of the cliff. He sings of a howling, empty wasteland, But the absolute center of the song is a single, repeating title. He hammers it like a drumbeat, repeating it 5 times as the shadows lengthen over the tents. He calls God the rock. The Hebrew word is tsur. It does not mean a stone you can hold in your hand. It means a sheer, towering cliff face. It is a massive, immovable fortress of granite where you hide when the desert storm threatens to tear the skin from your back. The rock is not a metaphor for abstract strength. It is the physical memory of their survival. Because these people know exactly what a rock can do.